Welcome back. In this video, we'll continue to use loops to traverse arrays and objects. As a refresher, we create an array in JavaScript using the square bracket syntax. Here, I've created an empty array named myArray. It's empty because there are no values between the square brackets. If I console.log the value of my array, we see the empty square brackets telling us this is an empty array. To determine the data type of the variable, we can use the typeOf operator. Running that code will tell us that the variable, myArray, is of type object. And since it is an object, that means it has properties. So we can reference the length property of the myArray variable, which will tell us how many elements are in the array, how many items. So if we look at the result of executing this code in the browser, we see we have 0 elements in the array. Now let's create another array. We'll use this array to hold usernames. So we'll give the array a name of users. Each username is going to be a string, so it will be wrapped in quotes. When we declare the variable with the open and close square brackets, we're populating the variable with values this time, the 3 usernames separated by commas. So this variable users is an array which has 3 elements. And if we write this to the console, we see our 3 items in the array. And if we expand this, we see them listed by their index. So if you recall, when we first spoke about arrays in a prior video, we mentioned that arrays are 0 indexed. So the first element in the array is at position 0, the second one position 1, and so on. So going back to the code, again, if we want to get the number of elements in the array, we can use the length property and store this value in a variable. So we can write out to the console whatever the number of items in the array, so the array's length, users in the array. So let's see what this looks like. And we see we have 3 users in the array. Because the array is 0 indexed, if I want to get the value foobar, the first element in the array, I need to use the index 0. So I reference the array's name, users, use the square brackets to indicate I'm accessing an element in the array, and then pass the element's position. So executing this code should tell us that the first user is, in this case, foobar. And if I want to get the last element in the array, again, I reference the array's name, I use the square brackets, and then user count, which is the length of the array minus 1, because the length of the array is 3. So we have 1, 2, 3 elements. But because the index starts at 0, foobar is at index 0, bizbaz is at index 1, and bing bang is at index 2. So I could have just hard-coded index 2 here to get the last element. But if we didn't know how many elements were in this array, because maybe we populated it dynamically from data in a database, or a user is entering values into the form and we're programmatically adding them to the array, we wouldn't know how many elements are in there. So if we take the length of the array, which we have in the variable user count, and subtract 1 from it, that will take into account the fact that the array is 0 indexed and give us the last element. So if we execute this code, we would expect to see the last user is bing bang. So let's go ahead and run this and just check that we see first user foobar and last user bing bang. And of course we do see those values. So remember, we can use the length property to determine how many elements are in the array. We access the elements in the array using the index, and the index starts at 0, and if we want to get the last element in the array, we reference the length minus 1. And now going back to the code, since we know how to access elements in an array by their index, we can use a for loop to traverse the array and then each time through get the element at the current index. So here we have our for loop. We'll initiate the index to 0 because the first element in the array is at the 0th position. And as long as the index is less than user count, so the number of elements in the array, we will execute the code to console.log the current value of the index and then the value of the element at that index in the user's array. After we write that out, we'll increment I and do it again until we have no more users in the array to process. So let's execute this code in the browser, and we see we have foobar at the 0th index, bizbaz at the 1st, and bing bang at the 2nd. Now just to show you, if I change this loop so that we execute until the counter is less than or equal to the user count, so now we're trying to process one more element in the array than actually exists, and we execute this, we see foobar bizbaz bing bang, but then we try to access a value at index 3 in the array, which doesn't exist, so we get the value of undefined. So be careful when you're looping through the array to make sure that you're executing as long as the index is less than the number of elements in the array. So in this example, we saw how to create arrays that start as empty. We saw how to create arrays and populate them with elements. And the last thing I'd like to show you in regards to arrays in this video is how to add additional items to an existing array. And we do that by referencing the array, so users, dot push. So we're going to push another item onto the existing array, and then we pass the value that we'd like to push to the array. So because users.push is adding an additional item to the existing array, I need to reset the value of users count to the new length of the users array. Then I can loop through the array again each time through, printing the current index and the value of the element at that index in the array. And if we execute this in the browser, we see index 0 through 3 this time, with the original values plus the new value that we push to the array. Now I'd like to turn our attention to object literals. And if you recall from a prior video when we first discussed objects, we saw that we declare them using open and closing curly braces. So here I've declared a variable named user, and I've set it to be an empty object. Now if I console.log user and console.log the type of user, we see that the value of user is an empty object and the type is of object. And when we looked at the array and interrogated its type, we saw that it also was an object, and we said that objects can have properties. So if we move down in the code and reinitialize the user variable to be an object with properties and values, and console.log this, now we see the object with its properties and values. Now, the properties and values are separated by a colon. So this user has a property of fname for first name, and its value is foo. Last name, property, value bar, same for email and age. Now notice that the values for the properties can be different data types, but the properties themselves are strings. And if we want to access a particular property's value, we can do that using dot notation. So here I'm going to console.log, go to the user object, give me the value of its first name property, then the value of the last name, and finally the value of the email. So if we execute this code, now we see the values of the user's first name, last name, and email address. Now, similar to when we looped through an array and got the value at each element in the array, we can also traverse an object and get the value of each property in the object. And we do that using a for in loop. So for every key or every property, and in this case we use key to represent the property to use as a key to get the value in the object. So for every key in the object, which is in our case user, I want to console.log the key and then go to the user object, and then in square brackets we pass the key. So the first time through this loop, the key will be fname. So go to the user object, use the key fname, and give me its value. So when this executes, I would expect to see fname and foo. Then we go back up to the for loop, and it checks to see if we have any more keys. Well, in this case, sure, we do. It's lname, so we would print lname, then use that key to go into the user object at that key and get its value, and then continue doing that as long as we have keys in the object. So if we run this code, we see that we've printed each key and its value. So now that we know how to create objects in arrays and traverse them to get their properties and the elements' values, let's put those two concepts together and create an array named users that will hold objects. So here I've created the users array, and here I've created a variable named foobar that will represent one instance of a user object. So foobar, as we saw in the last example, has an F name, an L name, an email, and an age. Now I want to take that foobar object and push it to the users array. So after this code executes, the users array will now have one element, which is the object foobar. Then we'll create another user object for BizBaz and push that to the array. And then finally, we'll create a user object for Bing Bang and push that to the array. And now that we have our three objects populated as values inside the array, we can traverse the array. So we'll set our index to 0, and as long as the index is less than the length of users, we'll loop through that each time through. We'll create a variable named the user and set it equal to users I. So give me the element at the ith index. The first time through it'll be 0 in the users array. Then we have a reference to that user object in the array. We can traverse the properties in the object and print the key and values. So if we execute this, we'll see we're looping through the array 3 times. Each time through we're getting the current object, and then we're printing the key and the value for that object's property. Now, finally in this video, because we have a lot going on here in this example, we're creating an array, we're creating objects, we're pushing the objects to the array, then we're looping through the array, getting each element, which is an object, and then looping through its properties and printing those out to the console. This is a good opportunity to show you how to use developer tools to debug your JavaScript applications. And of course, we've already seen how to write values out to the console, which is a very helpful debugging technique. However, in developer tools, if you click on the sources tab and then expand the folder to the path of your JavaScript code. So here we're at the top of our page, we're moving into the files, we expand the JS folder and jump into the JS folder, we actually see our arrays.javascript file. And of course, that's the name of the JavaScript file we were just working in. If I click on that, make this a little bigger, we actually see our code. Now I can execute this code, just refresh the page, it runs through. If we go back to the console, we see the output that we expect. However, if my code was executing and it wasn't giving me the results that I expected, let's say we go back to the code and instead of looping through the array until the index is less than users.length, let's change this to less than or equal to users.length. And as we saw in a prior example, we know that this is going to cause an issue because we're trying to now access elements that don't exist in the array. And let's go ahead and also console.log the value of the user. So let's go ahead and save this and go back to the code. We'll go into console and execute this. Now we see we're looping through the users. So the first time through, we've grabbed the first element and looped through it, printing out the values of its properties. Then we grab the second element and the third, and now we're trying to loop one more time because we're looping as long as the index is less than or equal to the length, and we get undefined. Well, that clearly isn't the behavior that we want. So how can we figure out what's actually going wrong here? Well, if we go back to sources, we can click inside of the line number column and set breakpoints. And breakpoints will stop execution. It will break the execution of the code in the browser when it hits a breakpoint. So let me go ahead and reload the page now, and you could see we've stopped execution on breakpoint on line 8. And now we can actually interrogate the values of our variables. So if I move my mouse over the users variable, we see it's an array. It has a length of 0. Now let's go ahead and put a breakpoint on line 15. Now we're already paused on line 8. I can come over to the control buttons and click play. That will play execution through until the next breakpoint. So now I've actually instantiated this foobar object, and we can inspect it. So we know that foobar is a variable, which is an object, and we see the properties and the values. If we go back to users, it's still an empty array because we paused execution on the line that's going to push foobar into the users array. So let's go ahead and execute this, and then we'll stop on the declaration of BizBaz. Okay, so execution is paused again. If we inspect the users array, now we see it has one element in it. And if we expand this, right, the element at position 0 is the object that we just pushed into the array. So I could come back, we'll just clear these because we don't need to stop on every execution of instantiating an object and pushing to the array. Let's just actually stop before we go through the loop. So we'll run the execution through. We'll pause at the console.log before we go through the loop. We could come back and look at the values of the array again. It's telling us here users is an array with 3 elements, and it's showing us that the 3 elements are objects. Of course, we could look in further and see the values of those objects. If we go to the console, nothing is printed yet because we've paused execution. We've broken execution on the breakpoint on line 38, which will be the first log to the console. So let's go ahead, put a breakpoint on line 39, and we can actually, instead of playing through, we could just step over that one line, go back to the console, and now we see we've written out users. And now we're about to loop through our array. And you can see here, we're at the for loop. We've declared the variable of I, and we've paused execution. And you could see this solid arrow. That's where execution is paused. So it's about to create the variable I for the index and set it equal to 0. Then it'll check to see if I is less than or equal to the length of the users. There's an open arrow here because execution actually needs to go to the users array and get the value of the length property. Then it will execute the code inside of the loop, which will loop through the object at the current element in the array. So we've paused execution on the for loop, and we're about ready to start looping through. So let's also pause execution on the for loop that's going to loop through the properties in the object. Go ahead and click play. Let's go back to the console, and we see that we've written out the object that's in the first element in the array. Go back here, and now we're going to loop through the properties. So I want to just refactor these breakpoints a little bit. So I want to have a breakpoint on the for that's going to loop through the properties in the object, because that will allow us to go back up and jump into the for to get the next element in the array, grab the object at that element's position, and then write it to the console. And then we're also going to pause execution when we loop through the properties in the object and write them to the console. So let's go ahead and hit play, and we know that now we're in our first execution of the loop through the properties in the object. If we go back to the console and we don't see any properties yet, we need to actually run the execution of this loop. So I'm going to go ahead and move that breakpoint down to the console.log and line 45. So when I click play, we're going to execute the code in this for loop as long as we have properties in that object and write them to the console. Then we'll pause before we write a blank line. So let's go ahead and play this through, go back to the console, and now we see all the properties for our first object. Now we're going to write a blank line out to the console, come back up into the for loop, check to see if we have another element at the index 1, which we will have. We'll get that element, put it into the users variable, write it to the console, and then we'll pause execution before looping through the properties. Let's go ahead and play, go back, and of course we have our second object. And if we go back and hit play, we'll loop through all the properties and print them out. I just want to show you again this arrow, which will allow us to step over one line in execution. So I clicked that, and you can see we're back up here at the breakpoint on the for loop. So we've actually accessed the first key for that object, grabbed the value at its property, and written it out to the console. Go ahead and step over again, step over again, step over again, come back, and we see first name, last name, and finally execute that, and we have the age. So now we've looped through the second element, which was an object, and we looped through all the keys or all the properties and printed them out. Let's go ahead and print that blank line. We'll come down to our last object and we see we have first name. I'm going to skip through looking at each console.log for all these properties and just jump down to printing the blank line, and then we'll go back up. Now, if we go back to the console, right, we see we have written out all the elements at the indexes in the array and all the properties for those, but now we see we have undefined, and now we know that we have our issue. So if I come back up here into the for loop and I look at the value of I, we'll see that its value is 3. But we know that users is an array that has 3 elements. And because the first element is at index 0, now we're trying to access the element at index 3, but the last element is at index 2. So when we look at the users, or users I, which is 3, we see that the value is undefined because there is no element in the users array at position 3. And that's where our issue is. So we can clear our breakpoints here, plays this through execution, and go back in the code, realize that we're trying to access one extra element in the array. We'll fix our code, of course, come back and reload, and now we get the values that we expect written to the console. So we've actually covered a lot in this video. We looked at creating arrays, we looked at creating objects, we looked at looping through both of them, we combined them together, and we used the JavaScript debugger. I hope that you're finding this interesting, and I also hope to see you in the next video.